You think you know how these stories go. A woman, alone, a train ticket in her pocket and a heart full of hope, a new life waiting for her at the end of the line. But what if the man she was supposed to marry never existed? What if the train station wasn't a destination, but a trap? And what if the two small children who find her in the biting Dakota snow aren't lost, but were sent on a mission to save her from a fate worse than death itself? This is the story of Linda Whitford. And trust me, you haven't heard one like it before. The year is 1887. The Dakota Territory is a beast of ice and wind, and it's hungry. The train whistle screamed one last time, a sound like a dying animal, before the locomotive vanished into a swirling wall of white. Linda stepped onto the platform, and the cold was a physical punch to the gut. It stole the air from her lungs. Her fine green coat, the one that looked so smart and proper back in Boston, was now just a thin layer of wool against the teeth of the wild. She clutched her carpet bag, the handle slick with ice. Her other hand held her hat to her head, a battle she was already losing against the gale. She searched the faces of the few people scurrying away from the station, but there was no one looking for her, no sign with her name, no man named Walter Briggs. He had promised. His letters were filled with promises, a sturdy home, a warm fire, a life. The station clerk poked his head out of his office, his breath a thick cloud of steam. "You waiting on someone, ma'am?" "Yes." Linda's voice was a croak. "A man named Walter Briggs. He was supposed to be here." The clerk squinted, pulling his collar tighter. "Briggs? Can't say I've seen him. And if no one's here to fetch you, you best find shelter. The hotel's full. Boarding house, too. We don't let folks stay here overnight." He looked her up and down, a flicker of something in his eyes she couldn't quite place. Pity? No, it was something else. Something harder. This ain't no place to be left alone. Her stomach twisted into a knot of pure, cold dread. He promised. But promises don't stop the frostbite from setting in. The platform emptied out, leaving her completely alone with the groan of a swinging sign and the howl of the wind. Snow was starting to cling to her skirt, heavy and wet. The sun was giving up, bleeding a weak gray light across the horizon. She was an anchorless ship in a frozen sea, and that's when she saw them. Two small figures materializing out of the swirling snow at the far end of the platform. A little girl, no older than 10, pulling a younger boy along by the hand. Their cheeks were rubbed raw by the wind, their coats thin and worn. They walked with a purpose that seemed impossible in this weather, their small boots crunching a direct path right to her. They stopped a few feet away. The girl lifted her chin, her eyes serious and ancient. "You need a home," she said, her voice clear and strong over the wind. "And we need a mommy." Linda just blinked, the words so strange, so direct, they didn't seem real. The boy, maybe 5 years old, peeked out from behind his sister's arm, his eyes wide and brown. I beg your pardon?" Linda managed. The girl, Annie, didn't flinch. "You look like you don't belong out here in the cold," she stated, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "And our mama's gone." She paused, and then she said the words that changed everything. The words that told Linda this was no chance encounter. "Pa told us to wait for the lady in the green coat. He said you'd be in danger." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind, the cold, the disappearing train. It all snapped into a different kind of focus. This wasn't an accident. This was an interception. They weren't lost. They were here for her. "Your pa?" Linda whispered, her mind racing. "Who is your father?" "Elias Monroe," the girl said proudly. "He's got a farm just past the cottonwoods. He said a man named Briggs was a lie, a trap. Said we had to get to you before the station clerk did." Linda's eyes shot to the station office window. The clerk was watching them. The moment their eyes met, he quickly ducked back inside, pulling the shade down. A cold wave, colder than the wind, washed over her. The clerk hadn't been pitying her. He had been waiting for her to be well and truly abandoned. The little boy Tommy tugged on his sister's sleeve. "It's real cold, miss," he said, his teeth chattering. "Our house has a fire." Annie held out a small bare hand. It was red and chapped, but it was steady. "He isn't here, is he? The man you were waiting for. He was never going to be, but we're here. Pa sent us to fetch you. Linda looked from the small outstretched hand to the darkened window of the station office. She thought of the long, lonely miles behind her and the terrifying unknown threat that was apparently right here, just feet away. She could stay and find out what kind of man the clerk was, or she could follow two strange children into the wilderness on the word of a father she'd never met. It wasn't a choice at all. Slowly, she shifted her carpet bag to her other hand and placed her own gloved one into Annie's. The little girl's grip was surprisingly strong. A current of something, relief, maybe even hope, passed between them. "Show me the way," Linda said. Annie broke into a grin, the first crack in her serious facade. "I'm Annie. This is my brother, Tommy." "Linda Whitford," she replied. "Linda," Annie repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Pa will like that name." They led her away from the station, away from the watching eyes and the false promises. The wind tore at her, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of just running away. Ahead of them, a thin ribbon of smoke rose into the gray sky, a fragile signal of life in the vast frozen wasteland. She tightened her shawl, stepped into the small footprints they left in the snow, and walked toward it. She had no idea what lay at the end of that path, but one thing was chillingly clear. She had just been rescued from a danger she hadn't even known existed. The question was, what had she been rescued for? The walk to the farm was a blur of whipping snow and skeletal cottonwood trees. The wind was a constant scream in her ears, and with every step, the warmth of the train station felt like a memory from another lifetime. Annie held her hand the entire way, her small grip a lifeline in the blizzard. Tommy walked on her other side, tucked into the folds of her coat. They didn't talk much, and Linda was grateful. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one more frightening than the last. Who was Walter Briggs, really? A ghost? A fiction created to lure her here? And why? What did the station clerk want with her? And who was this mysterious Elias Monroe, this man who knew she was coming, knew she was in danger, and sent his own children into a storm to find her? The farm appeared suddenly, a low, weathered house hunkered down against the storm. Smoke poured from its stone chimney, a defiant flag against the gray sky. The front porch sagged, the fence leaned. But it was the most beautiful sight Linda had ever seen. It was real. Annie pushed the door open without knocking, and a wave of heat and the smell of wood smoke and baking bread washed over them. It felt like stepping into another world. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, its orange light dancing on the rough-hewn walls. Linda stood just inside the doorway, stamping the snow from her boots, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was simple: a long wooden table, a few chairs, shelves lined with jars. But it was clean, and it was warm. And standing near the back of the room, brushing frost from his shoulders, was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway he'd just come through. His dark hair was cut short, and a thin, white scar cut through one of his eyebrows, giving him a permanent look of severity. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. There was no surprise in them, no welcome, just a quiet, steady assessment. He looked at her the way a man might look at a stray animal he's just brought in from the cold. Not sure if it's tame, not sure if it's sick. This had to be Elias Monroe. "Pa, we brought her," Annie announced, her voice filled with a sense of accomplishment. "Just like you said." Elias nodded once, his gaze never leaving Linda's. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask about her journey. He didn't ask if she was all right. He just gestured toward a chair near the glowing stove. "Sit," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Eat." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Linda hesitated, her hand still clutching the handle of her carpet bag. She glanced at the children, who were now huddled on a braided rug by the fire, whispering and stealing glances at her. She crossed the room, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and set her bag down. Elias moved to the stove, ladled thick stew into a bowl, and set it on the table in front of her. He added a thick slice of dark bread next to it. Steam rose from the stew, carrying the scent of meat and vegetables. It smelled like life. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave a slight incline of his head, his face a mask of stone. Then he turned his back on her, walking over to a small workbench against the far wall. He picked up a block of wood and a carving knife and began to work, thin shavings curling away from the blade and falling to the floor. It was a clear dismissal. He had done his duty, brought her in from the storm. Now she was on her own. Linda ate in silence, the warmth of the stew spreading through her. She hadn't realized how deeply the cold had sunk into her bones. She watched him work. His hands were large and calloused, but they moved with a surprising grace, shaping the wood with steady, precise strokes. He seemed completely absorbed, as if she wasn't even there. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scrape of Elias's knife. This wasn't the welcome of a man looking for a wife. It wasn't even the welcome of a friendly stranger. It felt transactional. He had saved her, and now he was waiting. But for what? When she finished eating, she set her spoon down, unsure of what to do next. Should she thank him again? Should she ask about the man, the lie that brought her here? His silence was a wall, and she didn't know how to breach it. He hadn't offered a single word of explanation. It was as if he expected her to simply accept this strange, terrifying situation without question. She looked around the small cabin. She saw a rifle mounted over the fireplace. She saw the heavy bar leaning against the inside of the front door. She saw the way the children, even while playing, kept their voices low, their movements careful. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress, and a chilling thought crept into her mind. Maybe she hadn't been rescued at all. Maybe she had just been moved from one cage to another. The station clerk had been a visible threat. But Elias Monroe was a mystery. And in this vast, empty land, a mystery was a far more dangerous thing. The fire warmed her skin, but a deep, unshakable chill began to settle in her soul. She was in this man's house, miles from anywhere, completely at his mercy, and she had absolutely no idea who he really was. The days that followed were measured in silence and routine. Linda woke before the sun, the small cot she'd been given in a corner of the main room cold to the touch. Elias would already be gone, out in the barn, the sound of his axe splitting wood a steady rhythmic heartbeat in the frozen dawn. He never spoke to her in the mornings, but every day without fail, a tin cup of hot black coffee would be waiting for her on the edge of the kitchen table. It was a strange sort of kindness, impersonal, a duty performed, like feeding livestock. She threw herself into the work of the house because staying busy was the only thing that kept the fear at bay. She mended the children's clothes, her needle moving with a frantic energy. She cooked, she cleaned, she hauled water from the pump, the metal handle so cold it burned her gloved hands. She was trying to earn her keep, to prove she wasn't a burden, to make herself useful enough that he wouldn't, what? Cast her back out into the snow? The thought was a constant, terrifying shadow at the edge of her mind. The children were her only comfort. Annie was bright and sharp, her questions relentless. She'd sit beside Linda for hours watching her sew, asking about life back east, about books, about the world beyond their small, isolated farm. Tommy was quieter, a shadow of his sister, but he would bring her his small, carved animals, a clumsy bear, a lopsided bird, and place them in her hand, his big brown eyes searching her face for approval. It was during these quiet moments with the children that she began to piece things together. Little things. Annie mentioned a man named Pike, her voice dropping to a whisper. He's a bad man, she'd said, her eyes wide. He wants our land. He says Pa owes him. Tommy, tracing the scar on one of his wooden horses, once murmured, Mr. Pike made Mama sad. Pike. The name felt heavy, dangerous. Was he the reason for the fortified house? The reason for Elias's grim, watchful silence? Was this Pike the man behind the Walter Briggs lie? The questions piled up, but she dared not ask Elias. His silence was a fortress, and she was a stranger outside its walls. One evening after the children were asleep, she was folding laundry by the fire when Elias came in from the barn. He didn't look at her, but he didn't go to his workbench either. He stood by the cold window, staring out into the blackness. You should stay away from the windows after dark, he said, his voice startling her in the quiet room. Why? She asked, her heart beginning to pound. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were like chips of ice. Because some men hunt at night, and they don't always use rifles. The threat was so raw, so direct, it stole her breath. This wasn't just about a land dispute. This was something far more sinister. She clutched the folded sheet to her chest like a shield. Who is Harlan Pike? She blurted out, the name tasting like poison. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He stared at her for a long moment, and she thought he would ignore her, turn away as he always did. But instead, he walked over to the fireplace and took down the rifle. He checked the action, his movements economical and practiced. He's the man who owns the station, clerk, Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He's the man who thinks he owns this town. He's the man who my wife warned me about before she died. Another piece of the puzzle slammed into place. This was personal, deeply personal. His wife, Mary, the children's mother, her death was somehow tied to this man, Pike. What did he want with me? Linda whispered. Elias finally met her gaze, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger. It was a weary, bone-deep certainty. Pike doesn't like loose threads. He knew your name. He knew you were coming. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. My wife, Mary. Her maiden name was Whitford. She was your cousin. The folded sheet slipped from her fingers. Cousin? Mary. She had a cousin she barely knew, one who had moved west years ago. They had exchanged a few letters, but that was all. It couldn't be. She knew you were in trouble back east, Elias continued, his voice relentless. She knew you were desperate, and she knew Pike was the kind of man to prey on that. He didn't want you for a wife, Linda. He wanted you as leverage. Another piece in his game to take this land from me, to break me. Suddenly his silence wasn't coldness. It was protection. The coffee in the morning, the neatly stitched tear in her boot she'd found one day, the thick wool scarf that had appeared on her peg. They weren't impersonal duties. They were the quiet, desperate acts of a man trying to honor a promise to his dead wife. A promise to keep her safe. But safety was an illusion. Pike knew she was here. And by bringing her into his home, Elias hadn't just rescued her. He had painted a target on her back and on the backs of his children. The fortress he had built might not be strong enough to keep the wolves out. And now she was trapped inside with them. The knowledge that Mary was her cousin, that her arrival was part of a dying woman's desperate plan, changed the air in the small cabin. It was thick with unspoken history, with ghosts and promises. Linda looked at Annie and Tommy now, and saw not just two lonely children, but her own blood. She saw Mary's eyes in Annie's defiant stare, her quiet strength in Tommy's gentle soul. Elias remained a locked room, but now Linda understood the key was buried with his wife. His silence was a shield, not just for her, but for himself. To speak of it, to give the danger a name, would be to make it all the more real. So they existed in this strange, tense quiet, a family of strangers bound by a secret war. The war came to them, as they knew it would. The first trip into town was a necessary evil. They were low on flour and salt, and Elias needed to buy seed for the spring planting. He asked a neighbor, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Gable, to watch the children. Linda knew this was for her own protection, but it felt like being left behind on the battlefield. As they rode in the wagon, the silence between them was different. It wasn't empty. It was charged. Every creak of the harness, every thud of the horses' hooves seemed to echo the things they couldn't say. The town's general store was a blast of warmth and noise. Men in dusty coats stood around the stove, talking in low voices. They all stopped when Elias and Linda walked in. Every eye turned to them. The conversations died. It was like walking into a room that had just been talking about you. Behind the counter stood a woman with a face like a clenched fist and eyes as sharp and black as a crow's. This had to be Mrs. Harrow. Well, Elias, she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. Look what the cat dragged in. Her gaze slid over to Linda, dissecting her from head to toe. Heard you had company. Didn't realize it was so Permanent. A few of the men by the stove snickered. Linda could feel her face flushing hot, a stark contrast to the cold dread pooling in her stomach. She felt like a specimen under glass. Elias ignored her, walking down the aisle to gather his supplies. His face was granite. His lack of reaction was, in its own way, terrifying. It was the calm of a man who was used to this, who expected it. It told her this was their normal. Linda stood by the counter, her hands clenched at her sides, forced to endure the stares. Mrs. Harrow leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for the entire store to hear. "A word of advice, dearie," she cooed, her smile like a razor blade. "Harlan Pike doesn't take kindly to people messing with his property, and he considers everything in this valley his property, especially things that wash up on a train platform looking lost." It was a direct threat, a confirmation. This woman was Pike's mouthpiece, his town crier. She was here to isolate them, to paint Linda as a woman of loose morals, to turn the entire town against them before the real fight even began. Elias returned to the counter, placing a sack of flour down with a heavy thud that made the tins on the shelves rattle. He looked at Mrs. Harrow and his voice was lethally quiet. "Give me the supplies, Martha, and keep your advice to yourself." Mrs. Harrow's smile tightened. "Just trying to be neighborly, Elias. Wouldn't want your new housekeeper to get the wrong idea about how things work around here." Elias paid for the goods, his movements stiff with controlled rage. He gathered the sacks and nodded toward the door. Linda walked out, her back rigid, feeling the burn of every eye on her. The ride home was a torment of silent fury. Linda stared at the frozen ruts in the road, Mrs. Harrow's words echoing in her head. Pike's property. The insult was a physical thing, a brand on her skin. When they reached the farm, she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why didn't you say anything?" she demanded, her voice shaking as he unloaded the wagon. "You just let her talk to me like that. You let them all stare." Elias stopped, a heavy sack of seed balanced on his shoulder. He turned to her, his face grim in the fading light. "Words are wind, Linda. Letting them get to you is how they win. So we do nothing? We just let them say these things? Let them treat us like dirt?" "I am doing something," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I'm keeping you alive. Every day I wake up and keep you and my children alive is a day I've won against him. You want me to start a fistfight in the general store? That's what he wants. He wants me to lose my temper. He wants a reason to bring the law down on me. The law he owns." He carried the sack into the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard. His words hit her harder than Mrs. Harrow's insults. He was right. This wasn't a battle of pride. It was a battle of survival. Pike wasn't just a bully. He was a puppeteer, and the whole town was dancing on his strings. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Linda lay on her cot, staring into the darkness, listening to the house settle around her. She heard a floorboard creak in the main room. Quietly, she slipped out of her cot and peered around the corner. Elias was sitting at the table, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He wasn't carving, he wasn't cleaning his rifle. He had a piece of paper and a small nub of a pencil, and he was writing. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his large, rough hand moving slowly, awkwardly across the page. He was forming letters carefully, deliberately. He was teaching himself to write. Linda shrank back into the shadows, a lump forming in her throat. He was fighting Pike, but not with fists or guns. He was fighting him with knowledge. He was preparing for a battle that would be fought with paper and ink, with laws and deeds. He was trying to learn the language of his enemy so that he could finally beat him. She went back to her cot. The image of his determined face burned into her mind. The silent, stoic farmer was gone. In his place was a warrior, sharpening his mind like a blade in the dead of night, preparing for a war he had to win. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had to find a way to fight alongside him. The tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing day. The failed trip to town had drawn a clear line in the snow. They were on one side, and Harlan Pike, with the rest of the town as his army, was on the other. Linda found her own ways to fight back. She taught Annie and Tommy to read and write with a fierce determination, using scraps of paper and charcoal from the fire. If knowledge was a weapon, she would arm these children to the teeth. One afternoon, Annie came home from the small schoolhouse down the road, her dress torn at the shoulder and a dark smudge of dirt on her cheek. Her knuckles were red. Linda's heart sank. Before she could even ask, Annie lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with a miniature version of her father's fire. "Peter Pike said you were a wicked woman," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "He said his Uncle Harlan was going to run us off our land and take you for himself. He said you belonged to him." The boy's words were a poisoned dart, aimed directly at the heart of their fragile home. "What did you do, Annie?" Linda asked softly. "I told him he was a liar," Annie said. "He pushed me, so I pushed him back, hard. I bloodied his lip." She looked down at her small scraped fist. "Mr. Callum, the teacher, is sending a note to Pa." That evening, when Elias read the note, his face was unreadable. He listened to Annie's story without interruption. When she finished, he simply nodded. "You defended your own, Annie, but you gave Pike what he wanted." "What do you mean?" Linda asked. "A complaint," Elias said, his voice flat. "A public disturbance. Now he has something official, something to take to the sheriff, the judge. He'll say my children are wild. He'll say it's because of your influence. He'll say this isn't a fit home." He looked at Linda, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something close to despair in his eyes. "He's building his case against us, piece by piece." The feeling of being trapped, of being slowly encircled, was suffocating. Every move they made, Pike twisted it to his advantage. Linda felt a wave of guilt wash over her. It was her presence here that was causing this. She was the weapon Pike was using against them. That night she couldn't take it anymore. After the children were asleep, she pulled her carpet bag from under her cot. Her hands trembled as she began to fold her few belongings. She would leave. She would disappear. She would walk until she found the next town, or until the cold took her. Anything was better than being the reason this family lost everything. She scribbled a hasty note, her tears blurring the words. "I am sorry. This is the only way." She left it on the kitchen table and pulled on her coat, her movements silent as a ghost. As she reached for the door, a flicker of light from the barn caught her eye. She hesitated, her hand on the latch. Curiosity, or maybe something else, pulled her toward the window. She wiped a clear patch on the frosty pane and peered out. The barn door was slightly ajar, a sliver of lantern light spilling out onto the snow. She could see Elias inside. He wasn't mending a harness or sharpening a tool. He was standing in front of a large, flat stone that was set into the dirt floor of the barn, a stone she had never paid any attention to before. With a grunt of effort, he was prying it up with a crowbar. Linda's breath caught in her throat. He lifted the stone away, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. Reaching inside, he pulled out a small metal lockbox, rusted and old. He carried it over to the lantern light and carefully opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was a book, a ledger, and something else. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, identical to the ones he carved for Tommy, but this one was darker, older, weathered. He opened the ledger, his finger tracing the lines of script. Even from the window, Linda could see it was filled with names, dates, and numbers. A record of some kind, a secret. Then he picked up the small bird, cradling it in his palm as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He just stared at it, his shoulders slumped, his entire body radiating a grief so profound it seemed to fill the barn and press against the window pane where she stood. It was a private, sacred moment, and she was an intruder. This was his secret weapon, the ledger. It had to be the proof he needed against Pike, and he had kept it hidden, buried in the earth beneath a stone, like a king's treasure. The bird must have been Mary's, a final keepsake. The sight of his solitary grief, his silent, desperate fight, broke something inside her. Leaving wasn't an act of protection, it was an act of abandonment. It was running away. She had been running her whole life, from poverty, from loneliness, from a future that seemed to hold nothing for her. She would not run this time. Slowly, she backed away from the window. She walked back to the kitchen table, picked up the tear-stained note, and fed it to the dying embers in the stove. She pushed her carpet bag back under her cot. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew she couldn't leave him to fight this war alone. When Elias came back inside, his face etched with sorrow and worry, she was sitting at the table, a fresh pot of coffee brewing on the stove. He stopped, surprised to see her awake. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Whatever is in that box, whatever this fight is really about, you're not doing it alone anymore." A storm of emotions crossed his face, shock, fear, and then finally a flicker of something that looked like relief. He sank into the chair across from her, the weariness of 100 silent battles weighing him down. And for the first time, Elias Monroe began to talk. He told her everything. The ledger was a record of Pike's crimes: extortion, theft, bribery. Mary had found it. She had been compiling her own notes, preparing to expose him. Pike had found out. He hadn't killed her, not directly. He'd arranged an accident. A spooked horse, a broken wagon wheel on a dangerous road. It was enough. The town doctor, another man in Pike's pocket, had called it a tragic mishap. Elias knew the truth, but he couldn't prove it. The ledger was his only hope. But without Mary's testimony, it was just one man's word against the most powerful man in the valley. "He lured you here for one reason," Elias said, his voice raw. "He knew you were Mary's last living relative. He thinks the ledger is just numbers. But Mary wrote a letter, explaining everything. She told me she sent it to you, months ago before the accident. Pike thinks you have that letter. He wanted to get you here, under his control, and force you to give it to him. That letter combined with the ledger would be enough to hang him." Linda stared at him, her mind reeling. A letter? She had never received a letter from Mary. I never got it, Elias. I swear." A look of utter defeat settled on his face. "Then it's lost. He must have intercepted it." They sat in the flickering lantern light, the full weight of their situation pressing down on them. Pike wasn't just trying to take their land. He was trying to bury his past, and he was willing to destroy their entire family to do it. Their only weapon was a ledger full of numbers, and their only hope was a letter that was likely gone forever. Just then, a small voice came from the children's doorway. "Mama sent a letter?" It was Tommy, his small frame silhouetted against the dark room, clutching his favorite wooden horse. Elias and Linda both turned to him. "What did you say, Tommy?" Elias asked gently. "Before she went to heaven," Tommy said, his voice sleepy. "Mama gave me a letter. She said it was a secret, for family only. She said to keep it safe from the bad man, and give it to the new mama when she came." Linda's heart stopped. Elias was on his feet, crossing the room in 2 strides. He knelt in front of his son. "Tommy, where is the letter? Where did you hide it?" Tommy looked at the wooden horse in his hands. It was the one Elias had carved for him, the one he took everywhere. With his small thumb, he pressed on a knot in the wood. A tiny hidden seam opened up along the horse's back, a secret compartment, and tucked inside, folded into a tiny, tight square, was a piece of paper. Mary's letter. It had been here, in the house, in the hands of a 5-year-old boy, all along. It was the key, the proof, the one thing that could save them all, or get them all killed. And now Harlan Pike had no idea it was finally in their hands. The game had changed. The letter was like holding a ghost. Mary's handwriting was delicate, but the words were forged in iron. It laid out everything, Pike's entire criminal enterprise, his threats, her fears. It was a dead woman's testimony, a voice from the grave crying out for justice. And it was addressed to Linda. It was a plea, a warning, and a hope that she would be the one to finish the fight. They now had the sword, the ledger, and the shield, the letter. But Pike still commanded the army. "We can't just take this to the sheriff," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Sheriff Brody is Pike's man. He'd burn the letter and bury the ledger right alongside us." "So what do we do?" Linda asked, the letter trembling in her hand. "We wait for him to make the next move?" "No," Elias said, a new hard light in his eyes. "We make him come to us, on our terms, on our land." But they didn't have to wait long. The very next day, the sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. A blizzard was coming, one of the worst Elias had ever seen. "Stay inside," he ordered, his face grim as he went out to secure the barn and the livestock. "Bolt the door behind me." Linda gathered the children by the fire, reading to them to distract from the growing fury of the storm outside. The snow began to fall thick and fast, plastering itself against the windows until the world outside was nothing but a swirling vortex of white. Hours passed. The wind shrieked. The house groaned under the assault. Elias was still outside. Linda's anxiety grew with every passing minute. Then Annie looked up from her book. "Where's Tommy?" Linda's blood ran cold. She looked around the small cabin. He wasn't by the fire. He wasn't in their small sleeping room. She ran to the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She unbolted it and threw it open. The wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it back against the wall. "Elias!" she screamed into the white chaos. He appeared out of the blizzard, covered in snow, his face a mask of alarm. "What is it?" "Tommy's gone. He's not in the house." A look of pure terror crossed Elias's face. They both knew this was not an accident. A 5-year-old boy doesn't just wander out into a deadly blizzard. "He went to find his little horse," Annie sobbed. "He said he dropped it by the old cedar tree." The same wooden horse, the one that had held the letter, it was a trap. Pike had made his move. He'd used the storm as cover. He'd sent someone to lure Tommy out, knowing they would have to go after him. It was a perfect diabolical plan to pick them off one by one in the chaos of the storm. "Stay here with Annie. Bar the door," Elias yelled, grabbing a lantern and a coil of rope. "No!" Linda screamed back over the wind, pulling her own coat on. "He knows your voice, but he knows mine too. He'll be scared. Let me come." Elias hesitated for only a second, then shoved the lantern into her hand. "The split cedar, near the creek. Don't get separated." Stepping into that storm was like stepping off the edge of the world. The wind was a solid wall, stealing her breath and blinding her with snow. The lantern cast a pathetic, dancing circle of light that was swallowed by the white darkness just a few feet away. She followed Elias, struggling to stay in his footsteps, screaming Tommy's name until her throat was raw. The cold was brutal, a physical pain that sunk deep into her bones. Her face was numb, her eyelashes frozen. It was a hopeless, impossible task. The world had been erased, replaced by a screaming white void. They found his tracks near the cedar tree, already half filled with snow, leading toward the half-frozen creek. And then they saw it, a dark shape huddled behind a large boulder. It was Tommy. He was alive. He looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was clutching the wooden horse. "I found it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But then a man told me to wait here. He said Pa would come." Linda didn't wait. She scrambled over the snowdrift, grabbing Tommy and wrapping him inside her own coat, shielding his small body with her own. As she lifted him, she saw another set of footprints leading away from the boulder, deeper into the woods. Someone had been here. Someone had been waiting, watching. "Elias!" she screamed. He was there in an instant, taking Tommy from her arms. But as he turned back toward the house, two figures emerged from the swirling snow, blocking their path. One was the station clerk. The other was a hulking man she didn't recognize. Both had rifles. "Pike wants the boy," the clerk said, his voice flat and dead, "and the woman. Give them to us, Monroe, and maybe he'll let you live." Elias stood between them and his family, a human shield against the storm and the violence. "You'll have to kill me first," he growled. Linda, her mind racing with adrenaline and terror, saw the flicker of an idea. The creek, the ice. "Elias, the bank!" she screamed, pointing to the edge of the frozen creek just a few feet away. He understood instantly. It was a desperate gamble. He shoved Tommy back into her arms. "Run!" he roared, and then he charged, not at the men, but parallel to them, toward the overhanging snowdrift on the creek bank. The two men, surprised, raised their rifles. But Elias was faster. He threw his entire weight against the fragile edge of the snowdrift. With a deep groan, A massive slab of packed snow and ice broke free, crashing down onto the creek below. It didn't hit the men, but it was enough. The crack of the ice, the roar of the collapsing snow, it startled them. They stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the spray. It was the only chance they would get. Linda ran, clutching Tommy, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. Elias was right behind her, using his own body to block her from the wind. They scrambled through the blizzard, not daring to look back. The image of the two armed men burned into her mind. When the glowing windows of the cabin finally appeared through the snow, it was like a vision of heaven. They burst through the door, collapsing on the floor in a heap of snow and exhaustion, while Annie stared, her face a mask of terror and relief. Elias slammed the heavy bar across the door, just as a gunshot echoed outside, the bullet thudding into the thick wood of the cabin wall. They were trapped. The storm was raging outside, and Pike's men were circling them like wolves. They were alive, but they were under siege. The farm was no longer a home. It was a battlefield, and the battle for their lives had just begun. The cabin, once a sanctuary of warmth, was now a prison. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the storm and the men who were using it as cover. Every creak of the wood, every rattle of the windows sent a fresh jolt of fear through Linda. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with only one rifle and a limited supply of ammunition. Elias was a different person. The quiet, stoic farmer was gone, replaced by a grim, focused soldier. He moved with a quiet intensity, checking the windows, reinforcing the door, his face a mask of cold determination. He handed Linda a small pistol she hadn't even known he owned. "You know how to use this?" he asked, his voice low. "My father taught me," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. "I'm a good shot." He nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good. Don't shoot unless you see them. Aim for the center. Don't hesitate." They spent the night in a state of high alert. The children blessedly fell into an exhausted sleep, huddled together on the rug by the fire. Linda and Elias kept watch, taking turns at the two small windows, peering out into the relentless, swirling white. The gunshots had stopped, but that was almost worse. It meant they were waiting. Waiting for the storm to break, or waiting for them to make a mistake. In the tense quiet of the long night, they talked. Not about the men outside, but about Mary. Elias spoke of her with a deep, aching love that filled the small cabin. He told Linda how Mary had been the one to see the darkness in Harlan Pike when everyone else saw only a successful, charming businessman. "She called him a man with a hollow heart," Elias murmured, staring into the fire. "She said he didn't build things. He just took them, and he wouldn't stop until he'd taken everything." Linda, in turn, shared her own story. A life of poverty and struggle in Boston, the shame of being an unmarried woman with no prospects, the desperate hope that had led her to answer a mail-order bride advertisement from a man who never existed. She laid her vulnerabilities bare, and in the firelight, Elias saw not a victim, but a survivor. Sometime before dawn, as the storm began to lose its fury, Elias looked at her, his face weary but clear. "When this is over," he said, "no matter what happens, this is your home, Linda, if you'll have it." It wasn't a proposal born of romance. It was a declaration of alliance, forged in fear and fire. It was a promise of family. "I'll have it," she whispered back. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the snow-caked windows, the attack came. A volley of shots splintered the wood around the window frames. Elias returned fire, his rifle cracking through the morning stillness. Linda, positioned at the other window, held the pistol with both hands, her heart hammering, but her aim steady. One of Pike's men made a run for the barn. Linda took a deep breath, remembered her father's words. "Squeeze, don't pull," and fired. The man cried out and dropped, clutching his leg. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. The stalemate was broken. Pike knew they would fight to the death. They heard a shout from outside, a voice full of rage and frustration. Harlan Pike himself. "Monroe, it's over! I have the sheriff and a dozen men. They have a warrant for your arrest, for kidnapping, for the attempted murder of my men." It was a lie, a bluff, but it was a good one. He's trying to get us to surrender, Elias hissed. Then let's change the terms of the surrender, Linda said, an idea sparking in her mind. She looked at the ledger and Mary's letter, sitting on the table. He thinks this is a fight about land and a lost woman. He has no idea we have the proof. She grabbed the heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. Cover me, she said to Elias. Before he could object, she ran to the front door, unbarred it, and threw it open. She didn't run out. She just stood in the doorway, the skillet held high, and with all her strength, she began banging it against the doorframe. The clang was deafening, a raw, desperate alarm bell ringing out across the snowy landscape. Clang, clang, clang. It was a crazy, suicidal move, but it was unexpected. The shooting stopped. Pike and his men, confused by the sound, hesitated. Pike! Linda screamed, her voice raw. We know about the ledger, Harlan. We have Mary's letter. A full confession of everything you've done. It's all here. She was bluffing about the confession, but he wouldn't know that. She saw him then, standing near the fence line, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The neighbors heard that, she yelled, banging the skillet again. They heard the gunshots all night. They're coming, and when they get here, we're going to read this letter out loud for the whole valley to hear. This was the final gamble. She was betting on the one thing Pike couldn't control, the curiosity and courage of ordinary people. He could buy a sheriff, he could bully a store owner, but he couldn't stop everyone. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the roof. Then from down the road, another sound. A wagon, and then another. The Gables, the family from the next farm over. They had heard the commotion. They were coming. Pike's face twisted in rage. He had lost control. The narrative was no longer his. He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Linda. But before he could fire, Elias was there. He fired his last shot not at Pike, but at the heavy crossbeam of the porch roof above him, already weakened by the storm. The bullet struck true. With a crack of splintering wood, the snow-laden roof collapsed, burying Pike in an avalanche of timber and ice. It was over. The aftermath was swift. The neighbors, led by Mr. Gable, rounded up Pike's injured men. Someone rode for the U.S. Marshal in the next county, bypassing the corrupt local sheriff entirely. When the marshal arrived and saw the ledger, read Mary's letter, and heard the testimony of Linda and Elias, the case was sealed. Pike's empire, built on fear and whispers, crumbled into dust. The station clerk, Mrs. Harrow, Sheriff Brody, they were all implicated, their web of corruption torn apart. The town, freed from Pike's shadow, began to breathe again. The looks Linda received were no longer filled with suspicion, but with a quiet, grudging respect. She was no longer the outsider, the housekeeper. She was the woman who had faced down Harlan Pike with a skillet and a story. Weeks later, as the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed through the muddy earth, Elias found Linda on the front porch. The broken roof had been cleared away, and the morning sun felt warm on her face. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her, looking out over the land that was now truly theirs. In his hands he held something, a faded cotton apron, its ties softened by years of use. It belonged to Mary, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He held it out to her. She wore it every day. He took a deep breath. I don't have a ring to give you, Linda, but I have this land. I have my children, and I have a heart that's finally ready to live again. What we did it together. I want to spend the rest of my life doing things together. Tears welled in Linda's eyes as she reached for the apron. The fabric was warm from his hands. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a promise. It was a legacy. It was an offering of a life, a real life, built not on lies and letters, but on courage and truth. She nodded, unable to speak, and tied the apron around her waist. It fit perfectly. From the doorway, Annie and Tommy appeared. Annie's eyes fell on the apron, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. Does this mean you're staying forever? She asked. Linda knelt, pulling both children into a fierce hug. It means I'm home, she said, her voice catching. I'm finally home. Annie hugged her tighter. "Now you're our mama," she whispered. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. They stood there on the porch, a man, a woman, and two children. Not a family made by contract or convenience, but one forged in a blizzard, tested by gunfire, and bound by the quiet, unshakable strength of love. They had faced the monster in the dark and won, and in the warm spring sun, they were ready to begin again. That's the story of how a woman left for dead at a train station, found a war she didn't know she was meant to fight, and a family she didn't know she was meant to have. It goes to show that sometimes the most dangerous journey isn't the one that takes you across the country, but the one that takes you across a cold, snowy yard to stand up for what's right. If you were holding your breath during that final standoff, and if you believe that the strongest families are the ones that fight together, then you're in the right place. There are a lot more stories out there about the quiet heroes and the hidden battles of the Old West. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because you don't want to miss a single one. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were Linda? Thanks for watching.